To serve as the National Park Service Superintendent here at the home of Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site. And on behalf of ourselves and the National Park Service and the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, I want to thank you for coming today, for coming to all of Shelby's talks these last couple of months. It has been a great dialogue, and I hope there's some of you that attended the Rebecca talk last month who are here for kind of the second part of James's two wives as they stand alone in their own identity and brilliance. I think hopefully she's going to change some minds about Sara today. She was an amazing figure that may have gotten a bad rap afterwards. So I also want to use this opportunity with Dr. Landmark's research and her work that she's been doing with us as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow. The importance of our FDR library and archive, our museum collections, really the important work that our cultural resource stewards do in the federal government. It is vital to have our archives that are open and available to the public, to do research, to read through diaries and letters and correspondence in their own hand, to be able to get a good perspective of who they are as people, what their vision was, what their intent was, over what we are assuming or what we may read in a book. We can take it upon ourselves to truth fact that in our presidential libraries and at our historic sites. So you'll see today a lot of reflection of the work that Dr. Landmark has done in the Presidential Library and Archives, in the National Park Service's museum collections. You'll see some images from, not to give any spoilers, but in the snuggery that was Sara's space in Springwood, and a lot of artifacts, museum collections, and archival materials that are why we are able to gather today and have a better understanding of these important figures in our history. So always excited to do a public service announcement on the importance of the work that our team does here on site. Dr. Landmark, as I mentioned, joined us about 2.5 years ago as a Mellon postdoctoral fellow. We had her working on FDR's history and disability representation. That resulted in a brand new exhibit last year on FDR's disability, located in the garage and stable area of Springwood. So that's free and open to the public. I encourage you to go over there and take a look at it, and the good work and research that she had done highlighting the different mobility devices that FDR used during his presidency and his lifetime, and how visible they all were to the public. When he went and spoke, threw first baseballs, planted trees from cars, and led his life as he would have with those mobility devices. But she has, through researching in the archives, dove deep into the family history, how he became who he was and who was involved in his life. And that has resulted in this talk today about Sara Delano Roosevelt, his mother, and her story revisited, to kind of do a deep dive into what we understand today, what we think today, and maybe what she would have been differently had we been alive in her time. Dr. Shelby Landmark holds a PhD in communication from Texas A&M University. She received a Bachelor of Science from Ohio University's Scripps College of Communication, where she specialized in media studies. She has published and presented her work related to disability and media in interdisciplinary academic journals and at national and regional communication and disability conferences. So it has been a real pleasure to have her with us for the past few years, and I am excited for her to present her latest research on Sara Delano Roosevelt. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Shelby Landmark.
We all probably have some perspectives of Sara that we're coming in with, and I hope to share her biography from her perspective and from as an individual, not necessarily from outside sources. So like Amy said, I started this investigation into Sara by studying FDR's disability, and there are lots of disability stories in the Roosevelt and Delano families, and I was trying to look for a biography of Sara, and the ones I kept finding were descriptions that largely came from Eleanor Roosevelt. And from what she would have thought, sometimes beyond what Eleanor actually said. So I thought it was time for us to do an investigation into Sara for her own sake, and not necessarily from the lens of Eleanor. We're going to get into the Eleanor stuff and maybe how this narrative got started, but there's no villains here, and I think you're going to be surprised at how much nuance there is. So Sara Delano, what really caught my attention on this topic was words like this being used to describe her. So overbearing, controlling, opinionated, dominating, oppressive, smothering, inflexible, domineering, dictatorial, opinionated, monster-in-law. These are descriptions I found of her just today when I was looking. But I've seen these over time, and as a woman who has had some of these words used to describe myself, it did pique my attention that these were how she was most often being described. And it usually, if I see a woman being described this way, I typically know that's not the full story, and that is from someone else's perspective. So I wanted to find out what really the truth was. And it doesn't really match with any of these words. Opinionated, perhaps, but other than that, it's not quite right. Really, I hope you'll take away that Sara was extremely family-oriented. I think that's not a surprise. That does fit with all of these narratives. A lot of people claim that those words to describe her come from this source of protectiveness of her family. But I'm showing you here, Sara in the center is pictured with her father and her mother, Warren and Catherine, and then some of her siblings and sibling-in-laws and some of the grandchildren. But she's in the center, and she was deeply ingrained in her Delano family, but she also was really involved in the Roosevelt family, James's side of the family. But you can see here, she's not even looking at the camera, she's looking at FDR, she's looking towards her father. Family was their whole thing. The Delanos, her sister actually described, she's noticed other families who seem to care more about outside things, but that the Delanos care mostly about themselves first, like they care about each other before they care about anything else. So that really helps us to understand her character, I think. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her mother. So this is Catherine Robbins. Her maiden name was Lyman. Her family mostly comes from the Hartford, Connecticut area. In fact, they were some of the founders of Hartford, Connecticut. Her dad was a prominent judge named Joseph Lyman. And she married Warren Delano when she was quite young, and he was a bit older than her, which we'll see that come up again. So she was, of these prominent families. Her and Warren had lots of cousins. I think that they added up that they represented, between the two of them, 13 of the last names that came over, during the Pilgrim era. So they have been here for a long time, so they were a good match. But I have here a picture of her with one of Sara's siblings, so this is Philippe. And then the very famous portrait of her by William West, which is in the FDR Library collection, and there's actually a print of this photo in FDR's bedroom. So he knew Catherine, he knew Warren, he knew Sara's parents, his grandparents, and they were beloved by FDR himself. And then I have some other pictures of her, including this one from the mid-1860s. It's not dated, but this picture was taken in Hong Kong, so we'll talk about how they lived there for a few years when Warren was involved in shipping things, which we'll talk about what they are. She had a lot of children. She had 11 children with Warren, so Sara had 10 siblings. 4 of them did not live to very great adulthood. So, and I added it up and I'll show you the years. Basically for 20 years, she was either pregnant or postpartum. So she had a kid every 1 to 3 years, which I can imagine was exhausting. There's not that much information about her except for in Sarah's diaries, which, like Amy said, you can access at the FDR Library. You can see them, and that's where I learned a lot about her, including that she really liked French food, and she enjoyed reading aloud to the family, even if the family didn't always enjoy it. And Sarah would later take on that, she would carry on that tradition of reading aloud to the family. Also, she had 5 months of typhoid fever, which almost killed her at one point, which was significant in the family. But those are really about the only things I could find out about her, which is a shame, but maybe we'll see some more. Sarah's father, on the other hand, there's a lot more information, probably because he is a man. He was quite well known for working in the shipping industry to Hong Kong and Canton in China, pre-British, owning that. So he shipped things like tea and silk, pretty innocent. He also shipped things like opium, which would become illegal in China because it was really harmful to their population. And he was there when the opium wars were happening and was involved in that. So not great, did build his wealth that way. And I mean by wealth, I mean millions and millions of dollars compared to for today. So by a young age, by like early 40s, he had built his wealth and come home from China. And then by 1857, we had a recession, and he actually lost all of that money, so he had to go back to China and earn it again. And at that point, he already had children, and he had to take his family with him. They actually joined him there, including Sarah. So she was quite young. She joined them there from 1862 to 1865, I believe. And you can see a picture of her from around just before that age. Warren is holding her and her brother Philippe. And this is a photograph that I haven't seen digitized anywhere else, but I have seen it in Sarah's snuggery. So like Amy said, at FDR's house, which actually was Sarah's house, her snuggery is kind of like her office, and it is full of family photos and family items, including the sperm whale tooth. She has a set of 2, which I think is indicative of her dad's history as being involved in the shipping trade, but also beyond that, before him, there were whalers and seal fur traders and any maritime related topic. The Delanos were really involved in that. So I think that represents that from her snuggery. But I love this photo of Warren holding 2 of his children because you don't get to see that a lot, but Sarah did. So there's a picture of him around 60 years of age. The one where he's standing, he's a bit younger. There, but then the photo next to him is Captain Warren Delano, and this is actually Warren's father, and like his name says, he was a captain of several ships actually. And the funny story about this picture is Sarah also has a picture of him close to her bedroom at Springwood, which you can see, but you might notice that he looks a little different than this photo, and the reason for that is, and this is a good reason why you should check out the library's archives yourselves. The back of these photos share something funny. So there were 2 versions taken of Captain Warren on this day. One version that had the description with wig, and that is the one you will see outside Sarah's bedroom. I'm giving you the inside of without wig here. So this is actually what he looks like, but the picture they chose to frame and keep in the hallway was with wig, which I think is interesting. But he, like I said, he lost all of his money. But then he gained it all back, so he was used to having luxury. Sarah was raised in that environment. Warren was a staunch Republican. He was actually quoted as saying that not all Democrats were horse thieves, but it was his experience that every horse thief was a Democrat. So when Sarah met James, who was a Democrat, he at first was like, I don't really know about that. They knew each other. They were on the board of the Consolidated Coal Company, so he was involved in coal shipping and coal transportation and the railroads. And so him and James were kind of colleagues. They knew each other, and I think that went a long way to Warren accepting him as a suitor for Sarah. We'll talk more about that. Here's some pictures of Warren in his later life. So he would live a very long time, and FDR was very close with him. If you go to the exhibit in the carriage house, there is a great photo of Warren surrounded by, I think, over 10 of his grandchildren, and there's a 14-year-old FDR with his elbow propped up on his grandfather's wheelchair, which is significant because it tells us FDR grew up seeing his grandfather use these very large, bulky wheelchairs, which I believe informed his decision to make a smaller one for himself because he saw how hard it was for his grandfather. Warren actually fell down an open hatchway 9 to 10 feet in 1876 and broke both of his hips, and he was bedridden for 8 weeks. with nothing to treat except basically morphine, and they had to just kind of wait it out. But his doctor said he would have to use a cane at least for the rest of his life because one leg would be shorter than the other, and that was the case, but he actually did use the wheelchair. Which you can see was very bulky. And then I have a picture up on the far left, which is of the home she grew up in, which is just north of Newburgh in Balmville. The home was called Algonac, and it's very tiny, but you can see a little Warren in a wheelchair, and then there's a little Catherine also on the porch. So they were not shy about his use of a wheelchair. In fact, when they had the house photographed, he was right there in the front lawn. But you can see in a lot of pictures, he is a central figure in the family. He was beloved. He loved the grandchildren, and they all loved him. And they all looked up to him. And Sara would actually say that a reason that she took so long to get married was that she couldn't find anybody who was as good as her father. So she said, nobody is like my father. So he was really important to her. Here's a list of Sara's siblings, so you can see how many there are and how quite probably unusual it was for her to have one child, growing up as one of 10. So the names that are highlighted in light green, it's kind of hard to tell, but I'll show you. Those are children who died young, so you can see the dates there. So Warren and Catherine, their first child was Susan. She died at 2 years old in China. And next was Louisa, but they called her Louise. You'll also see that's a thread, there's lots of nicknames, and it gets kind of confusing. They pretty much called her Louise. She was Catherine's very closest daughter. So when she died in her early 20s, it was very traumatic. And she died from an illness. We don't really know what it was. She had it as a child, and then it recurred, not sure. But that was really, really hard. And in fact, when their first child, Susan, died, Warren thought that he was afraid that she was gonna take her own life. So it really did stick with her. And I'm gonna tell you some sad stories today because I think it helps you to understand how important family was for Sara. And also because these people deserve to have their names remembered too, not just as the dead sibling of Sara, but I want you to hear their names too. Deborah, also most commonly called Dora, also Doe sometimes, like a deer. As you can see, she lived a very long time. She was really close with Sara. She married 2 Forbes men. She married one, and then she married his brother when he passed away, so she was a double Forbes. Anne, mostly called Annie, she married a man named Frederick Hitch, which you'll see some pictures of him. She also had a pretty long life. And then there were 2 Warren Delanos. So this is a common family name, and this will come up when we talk about FDR. But the first Warren Delano, who was the third, unfortunately died as an infant. The next child, they named again Warren Delano. So there's some confusion when you look up the one that lived to adulthood. Sometimes he's called Warren the third, sometimes he's the fourth. He is technically the fourth, but he's the only one that made it to adulthood. But again, he was very close to FDR and Sara. He lived 15 miles north at Steenvillette, I think is how you pronounce that, but we'll talk more about him. And then it was Sara, so she was quite down in the family, but she was called their dear one, so everybody really loved Sara, even though she was quite in the middle. And then her next sibling was Philippe, or Phil, and he was really close with Sara. They spent most of their time together because they were born, she was about 3 years old when he was born. Next was Cassie, or Catherine. She married Charles Robbins. Charles Robbins ended up dying young, and then she married the Reverend that did his funeral service, his son, Price Collier. All of these are kind of names that you might hear when you investigate into the Hudson Valley and this noblige category. Next was Fred. Fred actually was one of the members of the Federal Reserve, so he had a career in politics, just like FDR. And he lived a long time and was close with the family. And then last was Laura, and Laura died when she was 19, and we'll talk about that story because FDR was there. I forgot to say, Philippe died from brain fever, likely epilepsy. He caught some kind of fever in China, and then he lived to be in his early 20s, but again, affected him badly. So the youngest sibling, Laura, she's very important to the Delanos, and I'll show you how we know that, but here's a very rare picture of her with FDR, and this is right before she died. So this is how old FDR was when this happened, and you can see her on the far left. She was the baby, and she was their darling, they called her. And then there's 2 photos from 1884, which is the year she died. She had a really tragic death. Basically, the whole family was home in Algonac, and she was curling her hair with a alcohol lamp that was specifically designed for the little bitty hair tongs that women would use back then to curl their hair. And somehow the lamp poured fire onto her robe. And she ran downstairs, and they set in a blaze of fire. And Fred Hitch, the brother-in-law, actually picked up a rug off the floor and put the fire out. She unfortunately would die about 18 hours later. And so FDR was there for that event. He was 2-3 years old. He was there with his parents, and it was really traumatic. And I always like to tell this story because sometimes you'll hear FDR was afraid of fire post-polio, but he was afraid of fire very likely from this event. He had some other traumatic fire events, but this was something he witnessed as a young child and he heard about. And you'll see she had a lasting presence in the family beyond her death. So you can see this family portrait at the top. On the far left, there is her portrait. So even after she died, they included her in the family photos. The portrait on the bottom right is from Sarah's snuggery. She has at least 2 pictures of Laura in there. Not of every sibling, so she definitely held Laura close to her heart. And then you can see Warren with his personal portrait where he included his perhaps favorite daughter in that. And then lastly, the Algonac drawing room had a huge portrait of her. So FDR not only witnessed her death, but he grew up seeing her as part of the family. Important to note is that James also was very close with Laura, so she was quite a bit younger than Sarah, and she was coming of age around when they were newly married. So James and Sarah would actually take her to her balls and drop her off. And James had a relationship with her independent of Sarah, just like he had a relationship with most of her siblings independent of her. So he would take her for horseback rides, he would take her rowing, they would go on walks together. So he was very close to her. And actually her death prompted Sarah and James to travel to Europe because he had, she said, such a sharp attack of congestion of the liver from the shock of our dear little Laura's death. So it personally affected James. And I think that gives us an idea of how close they both were with her family. So they actually traveled to Europe just for that reason, so he could get the cure. But you might see her name also. Her family, her siblings started a Laura Franklin Delano Free Hospital for Children in New York City, which I can't remember exactly how long it operated, but for a long time that was a hospital, a charitable hospital named after her. Here's Warren the 4th/3rd, but he's the 4th. This is another sibling that was really, really close to Sarah, who also had a tragic death that FDR was kind of, a part of. Here's a great picture of him. There's a similar picture you might have seen with James and FDR, but holding one of his daughters. It's not labeled, so I'm trying to guess, but it's one of his daughters. He was well known for owning the property that their uncle Franklin Hughes Delano owned. He's the one who married Laura Astor, so he was very wealthy. So he had this huge, I think it was like 75-acre property that Warren inherited, and he had a huge horse breeding farm there. A lot of the horses that FDR and Eleanor and their children owned actually came from Warren, so he would breed the horses ideally to their specifications, and that was their relationship. Franklin FDR is actually named after this uncle, and there was some speculation and accusation that Sarah named him Franklin in order to get the property and the money, the Astor money basically. But the truth is that Warren had a son who died like a month or less after FDR was born. His son, I believe, was 4 years old. And that son's name was also Warren. And Sarah and James had planned to name their baby Warren after her father. But they wrote to Warren and his wife, Jenny Walters, of famous Connecticut Walters family, the art museum, and asked them if they would be okay if they named their new baby Warren. And basically him and Jenny said it would be too heartbreaking for them to have a new baby Warren so soon after theirs died. So that is how Franklin got his name instead, was from their beloved uncle, because James already had a James son, and she didn't like the name Isaac. So that's how we got Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The other fun fact about Warren is that, like I said, he was a horse guy, and he actually believed that horses would never be subsumed by the automobile industry. He thought that that was insane, and everybody would always buy horses for transportation. Unfortunately, that he didn't really see that completely not come true, but he had a horrible death in Barrytown, where essentially his horse bolted and he got hit by a train, and it was in newspapers a lot. And it was 1920, so FDR was, already had been running for senator and assistant secretary of the Navy, so this was published a lot in the newspapers, and he did attend that funeral. Okay, a little bit more about Sara as a youth. So like I said, lots of nicknames. Sara's nickname was Sally. She didn't really go by Miss Sara Delano until she was at least in her 20s. So she grew up, everybody called her Sally. James actually also called her Sally. I have a picture of her there as a young teenager and then a bit younger, around the time, I believe this is 1866, right when they got back from China. She did live in Hong Kong, and interestingly, on the ship over there, she was really encouraged, her and her siblings were encouraged to journal. So they kept journals about all the interesting sights that they saw, all of the interesting creatures that they saw at the different docks. Catherine she got Sara a gift of a parrot, so she had a parrot, not sure what happened to it. One of her brothers got a monkey. So they had this very exotic, fun, interesting childhood that not a lot of children that she grew up with would have also had. And it was here that she began her stamp collection, which she would give to FDR, and so he got a good start from Sara's travels. She attended a girls' school in Dresden, Germany. Other than that, she was mostly educated at home, which was common. While she was abroad, her sister Louisa died, and that was always really hard for Sara because she wasn't there for it. But interestingly, her parents believed that children should not only be seen and heard, they should contribute to the conversation, even if they didn't fully understand what the adults were talking about. So she was, again, raised in a unique environment where the siblings were encouraged to participate. And I think that really helped her to grow into a confident person and instill that confidence into FDR. Instead of being told, you're a child, you don't know anything about it. They were encouraged to explore. She liked to sing hymns. She read a lot. She was really especially interested in studying history. So again, I think FDR got that from her. She would so much focus that she would cover her ears, and her siblings would do anything to try to get her attention. But she would cover her ears so that she could read all of her books in peace. She was fluent in French and German. She learned how to draw from Frederick Church of the Olana House. And then during the Civil War, her and her sisters actually sewed muslin shirts for Union soldiers. So that's kind of a picture of her childhood. She was described as amiable and kind. And then as she got older, she was described more as very attractive, but still always kind of strong-willed, but always kind. Physically, some activities which were quite surprising to me, she was elected to an archery club, which she said her favorite part was the tea they would drink, but she did practice archery. She loved riding the horses around the property. Her dad was a huge horse guy, and she would be, usually her and her sister Annie would be the ones to go deliver or pick up the calling cards, like, come to my house for dinner this date. The sisters would be responsible for that. So they kind of had some independence in that way. She loved to drive their pony carriage, which was pulled by her favorite donkey named Jenny, which she made sure to note in her diaries. And then she attended a lot of dances with her siblings. So especially when her brothers got older and attended college, they would have dances and the sisters would get to go. And actually relevant, I just learned, the family traveled to Philadelphia in 1876 for the centennial. So we're back there, and I think it's appropriate that we're remembering somebody else who loved history. As she got older, she had lots of suitors, including the famous architect Stanford White, which her father called the Red Hair Trial. He sent her flowers, and he told Sara, no, I don't care for that. And so he was discouraged from any more pursuits, but she did have a lot of suitors that she and or her father turned down. And it wasn't just her father telling her this, but like I said, she believed there was nobody as good as her father, and so she hadn't found one yet. So by the time she meets James, she's 26, and she writes that she actually believes she's going to be a contented spinster. But then she goes to Mamie Roosevelt's house on Madison Avenue, so Teddy Roosevelt's sister, and she's introduced to James, who is a fairly recent widower. So he'd married Rebecca, and she had died a few years before that. And he was possibly trying to court Mamie Roosevelt, and Mamie wasn't interested and perhaps was like, here, be my friend Sara. Immediately interested in each other. And I believe that this is partially because they had a lot of shared interests. So they both liked to read, they liked to row on the river, they both really liked horseback riding more than was typical at the time, and they both really were dog people. So they had some things in common despite her being 26, and I believe he was 54. So quite a bit older than her. They only had a courtship of 10 weeks, which there was some writing in the family that was perhaps too fast. And there's a letter from James to Bambi where he says, "I do not think the affair has been in the least rapid or bewildering. As you know Miss Sally rather well, you must know how very difficult it was to win her." So that tells me a little bit more too about Sara as a person. So she wasn't easily won over, but he tried his best. And then in a letter from her father to her brother, her father said, "Of this choice of our dear one, I can say that it is very satisfactory to me, to Mama, to each and all of the family. Both Roosevelt and Sally seem to be earnestly, seriously, entirely in love." So I think that's also unique, that at the time it wasn't an arrangement marriage, it was they really liked each other, despite their age difference. And I kind of wonder if it's because he did remind her of her father. They both had this distinctive facial hair, they were both involved in the same activities and interests, and he was also a very upright, respected gentleman who respected her right to have an opinion. Which, if you came to my lecture on Rebecca, you'll see that's not quite unique for James. I think that I wouldn't quite say he was a pushover, but he liked his wife to not also be a pushover. He liked his wife to contribute her opinion and her ideas. So much so that eventually, she loved him so much that eventually, instead of saying "there's no one like my father," she would be quoted as saying, for FDR, "all I could want for him was to grow up to be like his father." So James really, I think, reminded her a lot of Warren. They were married in 1880 at Algonac in the fall in October, so apparently it was very beautiful. She wore a white brocade dress, pure white. She had tulle and old lace, and she also wore a 5-strand pearl necklace that James gave her, which she would wear for the rest of her life, and we'll see a picture of her wearing that later. There's not many pictures of them when they were young, but I have some pictures of them when FDR was a teenager and they're traveling abroad, so you can kind of get the idea of what maybe they looked like a bit younger when they were on their honeymoon. So they went abroad to Europe for their honeymoon, and Sara writes a lot in her diary about this trip, and she says that James cared for her devotedly, especially when she got a fever. He took care of her. They really enjoyed showing each other the places they had each been in Europe. So she showed him the school she went to in Germany and the schoolmates that she knew from that time. And he introduced her to the aristocratic people that he had met in his travels as well. And they seemed to have a really good time. And she remembered James, despite being much older than her, as being untiring and thoughtful of everything. So he's very considerate. When they returned home, James resumed his school board activities, his hospital board activities, and they were very attached to each other, so much so that when he would go on these trips or go to the city, she would ride with him in the carriage just to not be long parted from him, is how she described that. So even the short trip like that was too much for them, so they liked to be together. They enjoyed reading together. I love this picture of her because it reminds me that her mother was probably, reading aloud like this to maybe her husband, and James is attentive to her. Again, her kind of being the center there. There's the only picture I have of her riding. She's riding side saddle. This is her and James with their beloved horses here at Hyde Park. But by all accounts, they were really happy together. And like I said, her highest hope was for FDR to turn out like James. When she came to Springwood, she found the house full of Rebecca's things, and there's no accounts that there was any sense of jealousy or anything like that. She kept Rebecca's things and she honored them, including James's son with Rebecca, Rosie. They were super close with Sara, and Sara actually even visited Rebecca's sisters, so they kind of adopted her. And she would hang out with Rosie and his wife when James wasn't even there. So she really ingratiated herself into his life. And like I said, I believe that James was, the traditional head of the house, but Sara always had the ability to contribute her thoughts. She was not this typical Victorian woman that she's often described as being, especially in dichotomy with Eleanor, who was the progressive woman. I think she was quite progressive in her own way. 1882, they became parents of FDR, and if you've been in the house, you'll see that she had a very tough labor, and it was over 24 hours long. And in fact, the doctor thought she was not going to survive, so he administered chloroform, so she was unconscious when FDR was born. She did survive, though. He was 10 pounds without clothes, is what James reported, and he reported that in Sarah's diary. So when she was incapacitated for the recovery, which took months, he actually took over writing the diary for her. So that's interesting. You can see their difference in handwriting and that he's doing that. But we believe that her doctor advised her not to have any more children at that point because it was so difficult. And that was probably disappointing to her coming from a large family. And I think that really does help us understand why she was so devoted to FDR and how much she loved him. She probably wanted to have more children and she couldn't. However, she does get accused of, like I said, being very possessive and controlling of FDR, but she actually did tell him that I'm not silly and I have no intention of tying you to my apron strings. So she was aware that people thought she was too attentive to her son, but she didn't think so, obviously. The other story that she gets accused of as being this controlling mother was when Franklin went to college at Harvard. She, over the winter, went to Boston to be near him. The thing that has to be understood, though, regarding that is in the winter, a lot of the Hudson River families did not stay here because it was cold and there was no snow removal and it was hard to live here. So there was a winter season in New York City. Typically, that's where she would spend the winter. The first year of Franklin's college, though, James died very unexpectedly. So instead of going to New York to the townhouse to be alone, she decided to stay with her sister Dora, who we saw earlier, who lived in Boston. So it wasn't just that she was following FDR. I think she also didn't want to spend a cold winter, the first one, as a widow by herself. And Franklin was only 19, so it was very traumatic for both of them to lose James. And I'm sure FDR, actually I know because he wrote it, he found comfort in his mother being close. So she would host parties for him, host dinners, encourage him to bring over his friends. And it wasn't this narrative that is told that she was following him to college because she couldn't give up on her son. It wasn't quite that. And actually, James and Sarah had planned to follow him to Boston anyways. So had James been alive, he would have been there too. And I think that people don't know, if they don't know that, they think like she's insane for following him, but both of his parents were as equally devoted to him as she was. Okay. He does meet Eleanor around this time when he's in college. When he is 21, they get married, and I believe they meet when she's still 19. And there is this, what Sarah would call a fib, this narrative that Sarah encouraged them not to get married. So I hear this all the time. Sarah did not like Eleanor. She didn't want her to get married to her son, her precious baby boy. But Sarah actually wrote many years later, in the 1930s, she wrote in a letter that she was going to send to FDR but decided not to. She wrote down what she considered to be these 3 fibs about her that were being published in a biography about FDR at the time. So during her lifetime, this narrative started, and she was like, that's not true. And one of these fibs was that she didn't like Eleanor, and she encouraged them not to get married because of that. She did encourage them to wait. She did encourage them to wait a year before they got married because she said, you were both too young, especially Franklin. You are not graduated college, you don't have a career, you haven't built your own money, you're gonna be a trust fund kid and try to spoil your life away, and you have nothing to offer a woman. I'm paraphrasing here, but that's essentially what she believed, she told him, you need to go make a life for yourself, make a name for yourself, the way that your father did, before you get married. So it really was about, you don't have anything to offer her, not, I don't like her. They did wait a while, so they did listen to this advice, and Sarah actually helped them keep their engagement secret. She helped arrange them to meet each other without anybody knowing, which doesn't, to me, sound like somebody who doesn't want this situation to happen. And by her diaries and Eleanor's, they both really loved each other, and she describes having maternal pride for Eleanor, and you might know Eleanor's parents died when she was a child, so Eleanor grew up without parents. And Sarah knew that, and obviously you've seen Sarah has had a lot of tragedy in her life. I believe it helped her to have empathy to Eleanor and to express that maternal pride. Also because she only had her one child, so she really did consider Eleanor one of her children. And you can see, especially when Eleanor is young, she is consulting Sarah. because she didn't know how to run a house. She didn't know how to raise children. She didn't have an example to do those things. She lived with her grandmother. So she did go to Sara for guidance. It wasn't that Sara was giving her guidance unasked for. Eleanor said she would ask her for it. And she would later say that Sara was the greatest influence on her becoming an adult of anyone in her life. And I think it's also telling that Sara was 26 when she got married, and she married someone who was in his 50s. And so when she's telling her 19-year-old, son, you don't have anything to offer a woman, she knew what that was about. And maybe that's why she married someone much older than her, I'm not sure. So help raising the children was important. Eleanor didn't know how to raise children, so went to her for guidance. Help running the house. One of the other fibs was that the townhouse she bought in New York, which was half hers, half theirs, was unusual, and that was, again, a sign that she was controlling. But she offered that to them as a gift for Christmas. They didn't have to accept. And it actually was not that unusual for families to have neighboring townhomes. And the reason for that was because you love your family and you want to be close to each other, but also if you have a party with a large group of people who might not fit in your townhouse, you can open the adjoining doors and you have much more hosting space. So it was not uncommon for families at the time to do that, but now it is. Many people don't know that, and when they hear Sara bought them adjoining townhouses, they think that's very controlling, but that was not that unusual. The last fib was that after FDR became paralyzed in 1921, there is the story that Sara wanted to make an invalid of him, is what she said, and have him stay at home in Hyde Park and not have a career in politics. She didn't want that. This is the story. She said in her own words that that's not the case, but that actually if instead of using the house seasonally, like I mentioned, instead of using the house just over spring and summer and fall, you could use it year round. And so she's told him, I will open the house year round for you if you want. That's not the same thing as I want you to live at home and not have a career. That's if you need peace and quiet, which was her words, I will open the house for you, which was her decision to make because Springwood was her house. So like I said, when James died, she was 46 and Franklin was 19. If you're gonna leave your large property and large house and tenant farmers to one of those two people, it's probably gonna be the 46-year-old woman, not the 19-year-old son who doesn't know anything. And James, you can see his will at the FDR Library, and it is left to Sara. So it is her house, and in fact, you'll see a description of their dining room where it will be Franklin on one end and Sara on the other, and Eleanor next to Franklin. And that, again, is used to point out how horrible Eleanor's life was, but it was Sara's house, and that's why Eleanor's things are also not seen in the house. But Eleanor had her own house at Valkill, which encourage you to see all of her things. That is why Eleanor's things are not in the house, not because Sara said no Eleanor stuff. It was a bit more complicated than that. So those were some of the fibs that Sara herself was aware of, which unfortunately did, she said, deeply affect her, that she was being described so negatively about things that were not true and that Eleanor and Franklin knew were not true. And I think it's a shame that you will still occasionally hear those things without the context of the time, without the context of their personal family. Even today, you'll still hear it. Because that did deeply affect her, and I don't think that that's right. Also, there is evidence that she spoiled her grandchildren and that was a problem. I'm not going to deny that. She did spoil her grandchildren according to them. She loved her grandchildren, she called them her grandbabies, and I have a couple stories about her role as a grandmother, including that whenever Eleanor was pregnant, as it became close to her due date, Sara would lay out her clothes on a little chair next to her bed because she thought if Eleanor goes into labor at night, I need to be able to quickly get dressed to be there. That sounds like a very nice mother-in-law. That doesn't sound like somebody who thinks Eleanor is a horrible, evil person. She anxiously awaited for her grandchildren, and she was really thrilled when they had so many because she wanted that large family. The other really endearing story to me is when Eleanor and Franklin's first FDR Jr. died at 7 months of age. They would have another one who made it to adulthood, but they did lose one child very young. Sara was distraught, as Eleanor and Franklin were, of course. She said she was greatly aggrieved, and there is account of her going to the St. James Church, which is just down the road, going to the cemetery where that baby is buried next to her, actually, and she sat outside in the cold November until dark because she said she couldn't bear the thought of baby FDR out there in the cold and the dark by himself. So she sat out there in the cold. I don't like to hear bad things about her when I hear something like that, you know? That's very touching to me. And Eleanor knew that story, so Eleanor didn't reiterate those fibs. In fact, in her diaries, she talks about that maternal pride, and she talks about Sara being sweetness and light and very involved in her family. And that is a good example of that. I love this picture of FDR and his parents. This is in his dressing room. It's kind of hard to see because you can't walk in there, but there is a zoomed in version on the FDR digitized photograph, the library's digitized photographs. This is very shortly before James died. It's very close to his death. You can't really see in the picture, but he is really suffering from heart disease at this point. And I just love that Sara is reaching out to him. And you can see FDR, the proud, recent college student, their beloved son who was the center of their life. But this wasn't a marriage of convenience. It wasn't a marriage of arrangement. She really loved James. And she was really, again, distraught when he died and was disappointed to have to live the rest of her life without him, which she did live for a really long time. Before I talk about that, I want to talk about her interests as an adult really quick. So she really liked to be charitable, which was common for women of her class. But I want to tell you about some of those programs that she liked. The babies wards at the New York Postgraduate Hospital she donated to a lot. The Henry Street Visiting Nurses School. The Berry Schools for needy boys and girls. She was involved in that one, which was in Georgia. But then locally, for 30 years in Hyde Park, she taught a sewing class for Hyde Park schoolgirls. And she was also on the board of the Gallaudet Home, which is a famous, now it's a college for people who are deaf. She was on the board when it was for the aged and infirm deaf mutes of Poughkeepsie, which I think now it's, I'm not sure if that was like a extension of it or what, but she was involved in the board for that. So much so that she would sit next to patients' beds and communicate with them with pencil and paper. So even though she didn't know sign language, she would sit there and speak to these people. She was also really involved in the, last time it was the Mid-Hudson State Hospital that was referred to as the lunatic asylum where James's previous home had been just up the road. She was on a board of women who would go to the patients' homes after they had been discharged because the women thought, Sara and her friends thought, a lot of these patients were being discharged prematurely and that they weren't quite ready to go back to normal life. So Sara and her friends arranged for a schedule of they would go to these women's homes and check on them and make sure that they were eating and getting dressed and being able to be functional back again after living in the asylum, which again gives me an insight into she was not the typical classist Victorian woman. She definitely did believe herself to be of a certain class, no doubt, but I don't see James's first wife going into the homes of people who were of a lesser class than her and being with them there. She mostly wanted to be removed. I'll donate money, but I'm not going to be, rubbing elbows with people. But Sara did, just like Eleanor would later do. Like I said, Laura Delano Franklin Hospital, free hospital for children, was a huge deal. She would always send flowers very frequently from her rose garden. And then lastly, what's interesting is not only did she care about people who were not, she didn't know, she did care about former staff. So she had the same dressmaker from when she was a child to when she was an adult. Her name was Kitty Crummy. And when Kitty Crummy became ill as an adult, she couldn't work anymore. And when Sara found that out, she had Kitty basically move in with them and took care of Kitty. And another person was one of Franklin's former governesses, Alice Clay. She also had cancer and lived with them for a little bit. So she brought them back into the house to take care of them even when they couldn't work. and would do things like take them on sleigh rides with, big buffalo robes with heated bricks to keep them warm and things like that. And for Miss Clay, when she was getting close to the end of her life, Sara actually purchased her a ship ticket to go home to England so she could die at home. So Sara paid for that out of her own money. Again, not the evil witch that I think she's been portrayed to be. Lastly, this is really his last thing. I see some accusation of Sara that she was perhaps racist. I have not found any evidence of this compared to James's first wife, for example. If you know of it, I'd love to hear it, but I haven't seen it. I do know, however, that she was the person who introduced Eleanor to Mary McLeod Bethune, the creator of FDR's Black Cabinet. Sara was hosting an event at her house for this organization that she was involved in. And when she noticed that Mary was the only Black person there, she sat her next to Eleanor, and that's how they met. So Sara had that relationship first, and then Eleanor did. So I don't know where this narrative comes from, but I think it's unfounded, based on what I've seen. So lastly, Sara died 1941, so you'll recall FDR died in 1945, so he had her for most of his life. That was her home for most of his life, and she died from acute circulatory collapse when she was 86, and she died in her room, looking out at the Hudson very peacefully with FDR next to her. And towards the end of her life, she wrote to Franklin this quote that, "I have been an unusually fortunate woman. First, I had the love and protection of your grandfather, then of your father, and in my old age, you have made possible for me the interesting life that I am now leading." And that she's referring to all of the public appearances that she was making. So sometimes you'll hear Sara hated publicity. She hated publicity for no reason. She believed if you weren't doing something good, you didn't deserve publicity. But she went along with, taking photos with him at his inaugurations and going to his events and being her own public figure. She was beloved as the only surviving mother of a president in most people's memory. So she was beloved at the time, and she got to have a really unique life. And then I think the one quote that really has marred her reputation now is when she died, Eleanor wrote in her public column that her strongest trait was loyalty to her family. She was not just sweetness and light, for there was a streak of jealousy and possessiveness in her when her own were concerned. I think people take that last bit of possessiveness and jealousy and they take it too far. But you've seen how important Sara's family was to her, how she had experienced a lot of trauma in her family. So it makes sense to me why she was very close and protective of them. And when the one quote that gets misconstrued a lot is Eleanor wrote in a private letter, not publicly. So that's what she said publicly, that she was sweetness and light and protective of her family. In a private letter she wrote, "It is dreadful to know someone for 36 years and not really feel that bad when they die," which we might have all felt that, but that's not indicative, I think, that Eleanor hated her. She was saying this was dreadful. She was wrestling with that feeling. And again, that was a private letter, not what Eleanor said publicly. Everything else Eleanor said was very positive of Sara. If you want to read more about their relationship, there's a really good book called Sara and Eleanor. It's by Jan Pockrit, I believe is the author. Highly, highly recommend. She goes into a lot of the diaries and letters and firsthand evidence about their relationship and gives you a much more nuanced perspective. But I want to end with one of her grandchildren has recently been quoted that all Sara has been given in return for all she did is the reputation of an ogre, and it is unfair. And I hope that maybe we don't quite carry that on anymore. Thank you.